This is my true story. My son left home one gray morning with his lunch pail, his thermos, and a promise to be back for dinner. He was 24, strong, kind, and certain of his place in the world. I watched him drive away down our gravel road, not knowing that was the last time I'd ever see his face in person. Days became months. Hope became habit. Then, 35 years later, the television told me the truth I never asked for. Before I tell you what I saw on that screen, tell me where you're watching from and subscribe so more people hear my story. It was April 3rd, 1989, a gray Tuesday in Ohio, the kind of morning where the sky hung low and heavy, but life still moved the same. My son, Michael, was up before sunrise. He always was. He had his mother's discipline and my stubbornness. He poured himself coffee, tied his boots, and kissed her cheek as she stood by the stove. I remember the smell of bacon, the sound of the radio softly playing country music, and the way he smiled when I told him to drive safe. He laughed, said he'd be home by dinner, and that was it. The door closed, the truck engine rumbled, and the sound faded down the long road lined with bare trees. He had been working at the steel mill for almost 3 years, saving for a place of his own. He wasn't reckless, not the kind to run off or chase trouble. He liked his routines. Same breakfast, same route, same time he'd pull into the driveway each night. There was no reason to think this day would be any different. His mother waved from the porch until his truck disappeared over the hill. She turned to me and said, "He's growing up so fast." I smiled back and said, "He's still our boy." But as the hours passed, something about that day felt different. The air was heavier than usual, the silence thicker. Around noon, the sky began to drizzle, a slow, cold rain that seemed to last forever. I worked in the shed most of the day, fixing an old mower, checking my watch every hour. By 5, I was looking out the window, expecting to see that Ford pickup pulling into the drive. 6 came, then 7. The rain stopped, but the worry started. By 8, his mother was pacing. She called the mill, and the night supervisor said the same thing every parent dreads hearing. He clocked out like normal. No one saw him after that. His friends said he mentioned heading straight home. That was it. No arguments, no warnings, no strange behavior, just gone. I tried to calm her, told her maybe the truck broke down somewhere, maybe he stopped to help someone on the road. But when midnight came and the house was still silent, I knew something was wrong. The air itself felt different, colder, crueler. She made coffee neither of us drank. Every sound outside, a branch snapping, a car passing, made her jump. At 2 in the morning, I grabbed my coat and said I'd drive the route myself. I retraced every mile between our house and the mill. I checked every gas station, every diner, every roadside ditch my headlights touched. The road was empty, too empty. When I came home just before dawn, she was still sitting by the window, the same lamp on, her hands trembling around a cup gone cold. I didn't have to say a word. She saw the truth in my eyes. That morning became the line that divided our lives, before and after. Before, there was laughter in the house, plans for holidays, hope for the future. After, there was only waiting. His boots stayed by the door, his jacket still hanging on the hook, his plate untouched on the table. The air inside our home never felt warm again. I didn't know it then, but that was the day time stopped for us. Every clock still ticked, every calendar still turned, but nothing moved forward anymore. Every sunrise looked the same. One more day he hadn't come home. By the next morning, the calm had turned into chaos. His mother hadn't slept. Her eyes were red, her voice hoarse from whispering prayers into silence. I told her I'd go out again, retrace his route, ask questions, knock on doors. The sun was just rising when I pulled out of the driveway, the same road he had taken a day before. Every mile looked the same, yet different. I caught myself staring at tire marks in the mud, trying to guess which ones might have been his. The drive from our house to the steel mill took about 30 minutes, straight down Highway 32, past farmland and the old gas station near the turnpike. I stopped there first. The clerk said he hadn't seen anyone matching my son's description since the morning before. I bought a cup of stale coffee and left it untouched on the counter. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. At the mill, the parking lot was already full of trucks and men in gray coveralls. I recognized a few of his friends, boys who had grown up alongside him, now men with calloused hands and tired eyes. They saw me coming and fell silent. I didn't have to ask. They already knew what I was going to say. "Did he say anything before he left yesterday?" I asked. They shook their heads. One of them said, "He clocked out around 4, same as always. Said he was heading home." Another said he saw him walk toward his truck, whistling. After that, nothing. No arguments, no strange faces, no sounds of trouble. Just another ordinary workday that ended in something extraordinary and cruel. I checked the parking lot for his truck, but it wasn't there. It was as if the ground had swallowed it whole. I drove along back roads, stopped at every gas station, asked every driver I passed if they'd seen a blue Ford pickup with an Ohio plate. Some shrugged, some offered sympathy, but none had answers. By noon, I called the police. The officer who answered sounded calm, too calm. He told me that adults sometimes take off for a few days, and that I should wait it out. I told him my son wasn't the kind to run. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't owe anyone anything, but the man on the line just sighed and said, "Let's give it a day or two." A day or two. It felt like being told to hold my breath underwater and wait for rescue. That night, I drove the same highway again. The headlights cut through the darkness like searching hands, reaching for something that wasn't there. I pulled over every few miles just to listen. Sometimes I thought I heard his truck in the distance. Sometimes I thought I saw movement in the fields. But when I stepped out, it was only the wind. At midnight, I drove straight to the police station. My hands were trembling as I filled out the missing person report. I listed every detail I could think of: height, weight, scars, what he was wearing, the sound of his voice, even the way he walked. The officer wrote it all down slowly, like it was routine, like it wasn't the end of someone's world. His mother stayed home, sitting by the window. She refused to go to bed, said she needed to keep the porch light on in case he came home. That light stayed on for years. When I came back that night, I didn't have to tell her anything. The look on my face said enough. She broke then, not loudly, not dramatically. Just a soft, hollow sound, like something inside her cracked. I held her, but I was breaking too. That was the longest night of my life. Every minute dragged like an hour. Every sound outside made my heart race. I sat by the phone, waiting for a call that never came. When the sun finally rose, I realized what I had known all along. Something terrible had happened, and waiting wouldn't bring him back. The next few weeks were a blur of motion and silence, the kind of days that bleed into one another until you stop counting. The police began their search in the usual way: questions, maps, statements. They sent 2 officers to the steel mill, checked the attendance sheets, interviewed co-workers, and walked through the parking lot as though the ground might give up answers. They found nothing, not a tire mark, not a trace of the truck. It was as if the road had swallowed my son whole. We printed flyers with his photograph, a smiling young man in a denim jacket, hair combed neat, eyes full of something the world hadn't yet taken from him. We tacked them to every telephone pole, every diner wall, every gas station counter from Ohio to Kentucky. People promised to keep an eye out. Some took the flyers politely, others looked away. Sympathy fades fast when the missing aren't your own. Local news stations came for a few days. They filmed us standing on the porch, his mother clutching one of his shirts like it was holy. The anchor's voice on TV called it a mystery disappearance. Then, just as quickly, they moved on. Other stories came, louder ones. Ours got buried beneath them. The police dragged the river 3 times. Nothing. They checked hospitals, morgues, rest stops. Nothing. Every tip led nowhere. Some nights we'd get phone calls, people claiming they'd seen him in another town, another state. I'd drive for hours chasing those rumors, only to find strangers with similar faces and familiar eyes. Every time my heart would leap before it fell again. The seasons changed, but time didn't move inside our house. His room stayed exactly as he left it. His boots by the bed, his jacket hanging on the door, a half-folded shirt waiting for a body that never returned. His mother refused to wash his pillowcase, said she could still smell him there. She spoke to him every night, softly, as if he could hear her. I tried to keep working, but everything I touched felt useless. The world outside kept spinning. Bills came, neighbors talked, trains passed, but inside we were frozen. Every knock on the door made my pulse race. Every phone ring felt like it carried the weight of hope. But the door always opened to someone else. The phone always carried silence after the hello. The police called less often as the months went on. Their voices grew distant, rehearsed, like they were reading from a script written for people like us. "We're still looking," they'd say. But their eyes told the truth. They weren't. By Christmas, even the flyers looked tired. Rain had blurred his face on the paper. The ink had faded. The corners curled. His mother decorated the tree anyway. She hung his childhood ornaments, whispering prayers between each one. I pretended to believe with her. I told her he'd come back, that he'd walk through the door any day now, smiling like nothing had happened. But deep down, I had already started grieving a man who might still be alive. Years later, when I look back, I realize that was the cruelest part. Not knowing. Death has a finality to it. Disappearance is a wound that never closes. Every morning, you wake up and wonder if today will be the day you stop hoping. But you never do. Hope doesn't die, it just becomes quieter. The sheriff came by one spring afternoon with a box of his belongings they'd recovered from an abandoned storage unit near the state line. Inside were a few tools, a jacket, a photograph of him and a friend I didn't recognize. Nothing else, no answers, just reminders. After that, the search faded away. The police closed the case. They called it inactive, but to us it was a death sentence without a body. His mother never forgave herself for not stopping him that morning. She said she should have told him to stay home, that maybe it would have changed something. I told her not to think that way, but I thought it too. Every single day. That's how the years began. Not with closure, but with waiting. Waiting became our way of breathing. The months after the search ended felt like living inside a photograph that had lost its color. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt alive. The house that once echoed with voices, footsteps, and laughter became a hollow shell filled with silence. His mother stopped cooking. She would stand at the stove, holding a wooden spoon in her hand, and then just stop. The food would burn, the kettle would whistle, and she'd stare out the window like the world outside had stolen something from her she couldn't name. I tried to keep things moving, fixed the porch, mowed the grass, went to work. But it all felt mechanical. I was doing it for a house that didn't want to live anymore. Every chair, every photo frame, every coat on the wall felt like it was waiting for him to come home. We both were. We waited in different ways. She waited with hope. I waited with guilt. The first year, she still set a place for him at the table. Every night, there would be 3 plates instead of 2. She said it made her feel like he wasn't gone. I didn't argue. I just watched her talk to the empty chair, whispering little things like, "You must be tired," or "Don't forget your jacket." It tore something in me every time, but I couldn't stop her. Love makes fools out of the strongest people. The neighbors stopped visiting. At first, they came often, bringing casseroles and kind words, telling us not to lose hope. But as weeks turned into months, they came less and less. People get uncomfortable around grief that doesn't end. Eventually, they just waved from their cars, pretending everything was normal. I couldn't blame them. The silence of our house was too heavy for anyone to carry but us. His mother started sleeping in his room. She said she felt closer to him there. I found her one night sitting on the floor, holding one of his boots, rocking slowly, whispering something I couldn't make out. When I tried to lift her up, she said, "Don't move him. He might come back and think we changed everything that broke me more than any word could." I stopped talking much after that. Words felt useless. What could I say that didn't sound like a lie? Every conversation ended the same way, with her asking, "Do you think he's still alive?" and me answering, "I hope so," even when I didn't. I started sleeping in the living room. The bed felt too big, the air too thick. The house aged faster than we did. Paint peeled, wood creaked, windows fogged. It was like it, too, was morning. Mail piled up. Bills got paid late. The garden turned wild. Time didn't move forward. It only stretched, cruel and slow. Then came the anniversaries, the first year, the second. We marked each one with candles and photographs. After 5 years, she stopped marking them. I didn't blame her. There's only so many times you can relive the same heartbreak before it becomes unbearable. I remember one night, maybe the 6th year, she sat beside me on the porch and said, "Maybe we should move." But the next morning, she changed her mind. She said, "If we move, how will he find us?" And so we stayed, trapped in the same loop of waiting. Her health began to fade, not all at once, but like a light dimming. The doctors said stress. I said it was heartbreak. She smiled less, spoke less, and eventually stopped opening the curtains. The sun made her cry. By the time the 10th year came, we were two ghosts living in a house full of memories. The laughter, the birthdays, the noise, all replaced by the quiet hum of grief. There were no arguments, no anger, no shouting, just silence. A silence so thick that even the clock ticking on the wall sounded cruel. America moved on. The town forgot. But we didn't. We couldn't. His mother used to say, "He'll walk through that door someday." And I'd nod, even though deep down I had already buried him 100 times in my mind. Time doesn't heal when there's no truth to hold on to. It only dulls the edges of pain until you forget what real life feels like. The years after my son vanished were long and hollow, like living in a tunnel where light never reached the end. After his mother passed, the house grew too quiet to bear. Every room echoed with ghosts. I packed a small bag one day and walked out without locking the door. There was nothing left to protect, not the walls, not the memories, not even myself. I started drifting across America the way men do when they no longer belong anywhere. I worked odd jobs in small towns, fixing fences, painting barns, cutting wood. Anything that kept my hands busy enough to quiet my thoughts. I slept in motels that smelled of dust and gasoline, where the only sound at night was the hum of vending machines. Every face I saw blurred into another, but sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of someone, maybe a man with his walk or his shoulders, and my heart would stop. I'd stare too long, hoping for something familiar. It was never him. I learned how hope turns into a habit, one you can't quit, even when it poisons you. Every city had its rumors. A man matching that description works at the docks in Louisiana. There's a drifter in Colorado who lost his memory. A truck driver in Nevada said he picked up a quiet hitchhiker near the state line. I chased them all, every one of them. Drove thousands of miles across states chasing shadows. I'd arrive, find nothing, and move on. Hope can be cruel like that. It keeps you alive just to hurt you again. I kept a small notebook in my jacket pocket. Inside were scribbles, towns, dates, names of people who said they might have seen him. It became my map of disappointment. I told myself if I just kept moving, maybe one day I'd walk into the right place at the right time. But the truth is, I wasn't searching for him anymore. I was searching for the part of myself that disappeared with him. There were nights I'd stop at quiet diners, sit alone, and pretend he was there across the booth, drinking coffee the way he used to. I'd talk to him in my head, ask him where he'd gone, what he'd seen, why he hadn't written. The answers never came, but it made the silence easier to live with. As the years turned into decades, I learned how to live without expecting. I learned to breathe without waiting for the phone to ring, to drive without looking at every face on the roadside. I learned how to carry grief quietly, folded, not forgotten. In Colorado, I worked for a rancher for 5 years. He never asked about my past, and I never offered it. We'd watch the sunrise over the mountains each morning, and for a while, I found peace there. I stopped looking at faces. I stopped asking questions. I almost convinced myself that letting go was the same as healing. But the truth is, I never really stopped searching. I just learned to hide it better. Some part of me still scanned every crowd, every headline, every passing face. Every man about his age, now older, slower, heavier, made my chest tighten. I'd picture what 30 years would have done to him. Would he still have that crooked smile? Would his hair have gone gray like mine? The hardest part wasn't missing him. It was not knowing whether to grieve or hope. Grief has a direction. Hope does not. Grief eventually settles. Hope never lets you rest. I grew old without meaning to. My hands began to shake, my knees turned weak, but my heart, it never stopped holding that question. Where are you, son? By the time I settled in a small trailer outside Tucson, I was tired. Not of living, but of searching. The road had given me nothing but silence, and I'd learned to accept it. I thought my story was over, that my son had vanished into some corner of the world where love couldn't reach him. I didn't know then that life was waiting to prove me wrong, in the cruelest, most unexpected way. The years melted into one another like wax from a candle that never stopped burning. I stopped marking time by calendars and birthdays. I measured it instead by the small ways my world grew quieter. The phone rang less. Letters stopped coming. Friends who once promised to keep in touch drifted away. Even my own voice began to sound foreign when I tried speaking aloud after days of silence. The only sound that stayed was the wind outside the trailer walls, scraping against the desert sand like an old memory refusing to fade. His mother had been gone for over 20 years by then, buried under a tree in the cemetery back home in Ohio. I never went back for her funeral. I couldn't. The thought of standing over her grave while knowing our son might still be somewhere in the world felt unbearable. She had died still believing he'd walk through the door someday, smiling like the boy we raised. Maybe that belief gave her peace in her final moments. Maybe it broke her even more. I'll never know. I filled the silence with habits. Morning coffee at 6, news on at 7, a slow walk to the mailbox that was always empty. I'd sit outside under the fading Arizona sun, staring at the horizon until it blurred into nothing. I thought about him less, or maybe I just thought about him differently. The sharp pain of missing him had dulled into something softer, quieter, like an old scar you can press on but no longer feel. Still, some nights it came back. Always the same dream. I'd see him walking down our old gravel road, that same pickup truck following behind him. He'd wave. I'd wake up before he reached the porch. Every time. Neighbors came and went, most of them young families starting fresh. They'd wave politely, call me sir, ask about my past. I always told them the same story, that I had a son once, long ago, who worked steel and liked fishing, and that he'd moved away somewhere up north. It was easier than telling the truth. People don't know what to say when you tell them you lost your child to silence. Sometimes, I'd drive into town and sit at the diner near the highway. It was the kind of place filled with truckers, tourists, and locals who'd been ordering the same thing for 30 years. I'd sit by the window with a cup of black coffee and just watch the road. I think I believed that one day he might walk in, older, gray, maybe with a story about how he'd been lost and had finally found his way home. That kind of foolish hope is the last thing time takes from you. There were nights when the loneliness pressed too close. I'd talk to the empty chair across from me like he was sitting there again. I'd tell him about the weather, about the price of gas, about how the world had changed. I'd imagine him laughing, shaking his head, calling me old-fashioned. It was madness, maybe, but it kept me from forgetting his voice. Sometimes I'd wonder what kind of man he became, if he found love, if he had children, if anyone called him Dad. The thought made me smile and ache at the same time. I prayed that somewhere, even if he never thought of me again, he was happy. That he'd built the kind of life his mother always wanted for him. I grew old in that silence. The years stretched thin and flat. My reflection turned into someone I barely recognized. I learned to live with the unanswered question like an old companion. Always there, always quiet, always just out of reach. And then, one morning, everything changed. It was the same as any other day. Coffee, the creak of my chair, the flicker of the TV screen. But what I saw next froze my blood. Because after 35 years of silence, the face that appeared on the news wasn't a stranger. It was my son. Older, harder, but still him. It was an ordinary morning, the kind that passes without notice, where the air hangs heavy with routine. I had the TV playing in the background, the sound low enough that it blended with the hum of the refrigerator. I wasn't really watching. It was just noise to keep the silence company. My coffee had gone cold when I caught the headline crawling across the screen in bold letters. Federal agent arrested in Nevada identity case. Something about those words pulled my eyes upward. Then I saw the picture. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. The image was grainy, taken from a press conference. A man being led out of a courthouse in handcuffs, surrounded by flashing cameras. His hair was gray, his face older. But I knew those eyes. I knew that crooked jawline, that way his mouth tightened when he was trying not to show emotion. It was him. My son. The one I'd buried 1,000 times in my mind. The coffee cup slipped from my hand and shattered on the floor, but I barely heard it. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The reporter's voice felt far away, but I caught fragments. Lived under a false name for more than 3 decades. Multiple passports. Federal investigation. Marriage records across 3 states. Each word hit like a hammer. I stared at the television, waiting for someone to correct the story, to say there had been a mistake. But there wasn't one. His name, or at least the name he'd been using, flashed across the bottom of the screen. Beneath it, smaller text read, "Born in Ohio, missing since 1989. That was the confirmation. The air left my lungs. It was like watching a ghost stand up from the grave and introduce himself to the world. I leaned forward, trembling, tracing his image with my finger on the screen. He looked healthy. Older, yes, but strong. The kind of strong that comes from a life lived, not lost. But there was something else in his expression. A hardness, a distance. The boy I had known had kindness in his eyes. This man had walls. The newscaster kept talking, voice steady and clinical. Neighbors describe him as quiet, disciplined, a man who kept to himself. He worked for the government under an assumed identity. Married twice, divorced once, no known children. Married twice, no children. A man with no past, no trace of family. My throat tightened. All those years I'd told people he was out there somewhere, that maybe he'd lost his memory, maybe he couldn't come back. All of it shattered in a single sentence. He hadn't been lost. He had chosen to disappear. He had built a whole new life while I'd spent mine searching the shadows of the old one. I turned off the TV, but the silence afterward was deafening. It wasn't relief that filled me. It was confusion, disbelief, and something darker I didn't want to name. I walked outside and sat on the steps of the trailer, staring at the sky as if it could give me answers. I had spent 35 years asking where he went. Now I knew. But knowing hurt worse than not knowing ever did. For hours, I sat there, letting the desert heat press against my skin. I thought about the young man who left our driveway in 1989, full of plans, and the stranger on the news with handcuffs around his wrists. Somewhere between those 2 images, the boy I raised had vanished, not into death, but into someone else's name. I turned the TV back on later that night, hoping to see more. They replayed the clip. This time I noticed the briefest moment when he looked up at the cameras. Just a flick of his eyes. For a second, it felt like he was looking straight at me. Like he knew. Like he always knew I'd still be watching. That's when I understood. He hadn't disappeared by accident. He had walked away from us, from everything, to become someone new. And now the world knew him again, just not as my son. That night I didn't sleep. I kept replaying the news clip over and over in my head, each frame a wound that refused to close. 35 years of wondering had ended not with peace, but with a deeper kind of torment. The realization that my son hadn't been taken, lost, or hurt. He had chosen to disappear. He had erased us. I sat in my chair, staring at the blank screen long after the broadcast ended, the static whispering like ghosts through the speakers. The next morning, I turned on the radio, hoping to hear more details. The same voice from the night before came on, calm and professional. Authorities confirm the suspect lived under multiple aliases since 1990. Known locally as Robert Hale, he worked as a private contractor for the federal government. The words didn't feel real. Robert Hale. My son, who had once signed his name in shaky, boyish letters on his school papers, now had a stranger's name, a stranger's life, a stranger's story. I sat at my small kitchen table trying to make sense of it. Every theory I had built over decades collapsed. He hadn't been kidnapped. He hadn't suffered amnesia. He hadn't been buried in some forgotten field. He had walked away willingly. And in doing so, he had built a life where I did not exist. The news anchor said he had been living in Nevada for most of those years, working under a government contract, traveling often, blending into the crowd. The neighbors described him as disciplined, polite, but distant. He didn't talk much about his past, one woman said. He told us his family died years ago. That line broke me in half. He told people we were dead. I thought of his mother, how she had gone to her grave still praying for his return. She'd kept his birthday cake recipe in the drawer, made one every April, placed a single candle on top. For 35 years, she whispered his name every night before bed. And all that time, he was out there, alive, pretending we never existed. I walked outside and looked up at the Arizona sky. It was endless and cruelly bright. I asked out loud, though no one was there to hear. Why? Maybe he'd felt trapped. Maybe he wanted freedom. Maybe he wanted to become someone better than what he was. I could have forgiven almost anything, a crime, a secret, even running away. But this was different. He hadn't just left. He had rewritten himself. He had edited us out of his life story. The more I thought about it, the clearer the picture became. He'd left that morning in 1989 with a plan. The job he said he was going to. Maybe it was just the start of his escape. Maybe he'd been planning it for months. A fake ID, a different state, a new name. I remembered the books he used to read about soldiers and secret agents. Maybe he thought starting over would make him untouchable. Maybe he was right. The news continued through the week. They called it identity fraud, but it felt like something more profound, like a theft of truth itself. He had 2 marriages, both under his false name. No children, no trace of the boy who once sat at our kitchen table, laughing, saying he'd take care of us when we grew old. That promise echoed in my head, bitter and hollow. I found myself pacing the floor that night, torn between anger and pride. Anger that he had erased me, pride that he had survived. Somehow, in a twisted way, both feelings existed side by side. Maybe he had wanted to protect us from something. Maybe he thought disappearing was the only way. I'll never know. But the hardest truth wasn't that he was alive. It was that he didn't want to be found. The boy who once clung to my hand in crowds had turned into a man who hid his name from the world, and maybe from himself. For 3 days after seeing him on the news, I lived in a haze that felt half like a dream, half like punishment. I didn't eat. I didn't speak. I just sat by the phone, listening to it stay silent. The desert wind outside my trailer never stopped, brushing against the tin walls like the ticking of a clock that refused to let me rest. I needed to see him, to hear his voice, to ask him why. I didn't care if he hated me or if he denied everything. I just needed to see his eyes again and know that somewhere inside that new name, my son still existed. So I called the police station in Nevada. My voice shook when I said his real name, the one I had whispered for 35 years. The officer on the line paused, asked for my relation, then told me to hold. I waited, gripping the receiver so tight my knuckles turned white. When he came back, his voice was different, softer, cautious. "Sir," he said, "he doesn't wish to speak with anyone from his past." Those words hit harder than any truth the news had offered. My heart sank like a stone in deep water. I asked again, desperate, explaining who I was, that I was his father, that his mother had died waiting for him, that I only wanted 5 minutes, no questions, no judgment. The line went quiet. I thought maybe he'd changed his mind, maybe he'd taken the phone. But then the officer sighed and said, "I'm sorry." He said his family passed away years ago. He said there's been a mistake. That sentence hollowed me out. He said his family passed away years ago. For decades I had prayed for him to be alive, to be safe, to be happy. Now I had that answer. But I hadn't imagined it would come wrapped in rejection. I wasn't just forgotten. I was erased. I hung up without another word. My hand trembled as I set the phone back down. I felt like I was standing in the ruins of something sacred, something I had spent my whole life protecting. The truth wasn't that my son had died. It was that he had buried us himself. That night, I pulled out the old box from under my bed, the one filled with his childhood. School drawings, report cards, a birthday card that said, "To the best dad in the world." His handwriting was shaky, uneven. I traced the letters with my finger until they blurred through tears. How could that boy, who once said he wanted to be just like me, grow into a man who pretended I never existed? I didn't sleep. I didn't even lie down. I sat on the porch until sunrise, watching the light crawl slowly across the desert. For the first time in my life, I felt old, not in my bones, but in my soul. The years of searching, the nights of prayer, the miles I'd walked, they all collapsed into a single truth. He didn't want to be found. Over the next few weeks, I wrote him letters, dozens of them. I sent them to the federal holding facility listed in the reports. I told him I wasn't angry. I told him I forgave him, even if I didn't understand. I told him I'd still call him my son, even if he called me nothing at all. None of them came back marked, "Return to sender," but I never got a reply. Maybe he read them, maybe he tore them apart. I'll never know. The news moved on, as it always does. The story disappeared from the headlines, replaced by newer tragedies, newer names. But I couldn't move on. Every time I turned on the TV, I expected to see his face again. I started keeping the volume low, afraid I'd miss it if they said his name. Eventually, the phone calls stopped. No one from the authorities reached out again. The last thing I heard was that he was released pending further investigation, but no one knew where he went next. Just like before, he vanished. Except this time it wasn't a mystery, it was a choice. The son I had mourned for 35 years was alive. And yet, in every way that mattered, he was still gone. I used to think the cruelest thing a man could endure was loss. But now I know. It's not losing someone that destroys you. It's realizing they chose to disappear. My son left for work one morning, and I buried him in my heart that same night. For 35 years, I carried his memory like a wound that never closed, only to learn that while I was grieving, he was breathing, walking, laughing somewhere else, under another name, another life, another sky. There's no word for that kind of grief. It isn't death, and it isn't life. It's a ghost that lives inside you and refuses to leave. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine what I would say to him if I ever saw him again. I wouldn't ask where he'd been. I wouldn't ask why. I'd just tell him that his mother never stopped loving him, even when her body gave out. That she kept his picture on the table beside her bed until the end. That I buried her wearing the same necklace he'd bought her for Mother's Day when he was 13. I'd tell him that every decision I made, every move I took after he disappeared, had been shaped by that hollow space he left behind. And maybe then, for a moment, he'd understand the price of his silence. There are mornings when I wake up and forget he's alive. For a few seconds, I believe the story I told myself all those years. That he was taken, that he didn't have a choice, that somewhere he was calling out for me and I just couldn't hear. But then the truth rushes back. He wasn't calling for me. He never planned to. He didn't want to be found. And that knowledge sits heavier than any tombstone. I don't blame him anymore. Maybe he needed to run from something I'll never understand, from small-town expectations, from the kind of father I was, from the life that felt too small for his dreams. Maybe he thought he'd come back someday, but time has a way of hardening the distance between people. Maybe 1 year became 5, then 10, then 35. By then, maybe it was easier to pretend we were gone than to face the wreckage of what he'd done. I'll never know his reasons, and that's the part that will follow me into the grave. Sometimes I still talk to him. Not the man on the news, but the boy I raised. The one who used to ride his bike down our street. The one who laughed too loud at his mother's stories. The one who used to fall asleep on the couch with his shoes still on. That version of him still exists, not in the world, but in me. And maybe that's enough. The world has grown smaller since he left. I no longer chase rumors or check the mail expecting answers. The road outside my trailer stretches on for miles, empty and endless, and I've learned to accept that some stories don't have tidy endings. Some just fade quietly until only one person remembers how they began. People say time heals. It doesn't. It just teaches you how to carry pain without flinching. It teaches you how to smile at strangers while holding a grave inside your chest. It teaches you that love doesn't end. It just changes shape. It becomes something quieter, something only you can hear. If he's still out there, maybe he'll see this story someday. Maybe he'll recognize my voice, the same one that used to call him in for dinner. Maybe he'll remember the sound of the porch door creaking open, the smell of his mother's cooking, the weight of the life he left behind. And maybe, just maybe, he'll realize what 35 years of silence really cost. He left for work one morning and never came back. 35 years later, I saw his face on the news, alive, older, unrecognizable. The world called him someone else, but I knew. He was still my son, and even now, after everything, if he ever knocked on my door, I'd open it. He vanished once as my boy and reappeared as a stranger, but even strangers carry the shadows of who they used to be.